I'd like to thank everyone for coming to Jim LeMaster's talk on the relationship of Bacon, teleology, and non-naturalism to the doctrine of methodological naturalism. All right, Jim, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you guys. Thanks for coming and being willing to listen for a few minutes. I hope that my title is descriptive enough, and I want to make sure I keep an eye on the clock. I have, what, 30 minutes or so?
You have 30 minutes to talk, and then you'll have 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A.
Okay.
And I'll give you a warning near the end.
That's good, thank you. One of the things I've noticed going to various of the presentations today is at least a couple of them have strongly related to my topic, which is fun in a way because I'm just learning things, even just in the process of this one day that could be included. The biggest part that eventually we'll get to here is analogy, but let's start off with Francis Bacon, okay? The first thing, see if I can get my PowerPoint to work, there you go, is that some scholars claim or recognize Bacon as a pioneer of methodological naturalism. I'm very sorry, I threw this PowerPoint together very, very quickly. I'm actually spent a lot more time writing the article, and so my PowerPoint isn't tremendously professional, but I hope it'll be clear. Anyway, a lot of scholars, or at least several, seem to trace the roots of methodological naturalism back to Francis Bacon. Michael Ruse, for instance, said that Bacon, although he didn't want to deny, says he did not want to deny that God stands behind his design, but Bacon did want to keep this kind of thinking out of his science. This couple of philosophers here, Poe and Middick, they said that as they talk about this scientific revolution in the 1600s, they said it began with Bacon's proposal for a new discipline method for the study of the physical world. And he made a clear distinction between two broad causal categories, metaphysics and physics. And they say here that metaphysics focuses on final or ultimate causes, and then the physics section would be observations of immediate causes. And of course, Bacon more specifically related those back to Aristotle and his material causes and efficient causes. So he made a very strict distinction, delineation of two areas of science, although metaphysics probably wouldn't be called science today. He was lumping them all together in what he called natural philosophy. Another guy, Cornelius Hunter, makes this comment that Bacon realized as he was restricting physics just to this naturalism realm, he was going to exclude any realistic true explanations that were not strictly naturalistic. So he forfeited completeness, according to Hunter. Science would not investigate all things. Okay, so what exactly did Bacon say? This little chart hopefully will clarify some of the difference, physics on the right, metaphysics on the left, and I'm just quoting directly from his writings. I believe, what was the name of that? It's called the Augmentus Scientiarum, one of his books. Physics deals with that which is most inherent in matter and therefore transitory, supposes in nature only a being and moving in natural necessity, inquires and handles the material and efficient causes, whereas metaphysics deals with that which is more abstracted and fixed, supposes also a mind and idea. I think that's important, and that'll come up again. And then the formal and final causes he placed in the realm of metaphysics. Now, what I would like to talk about first is teleology. Now, for the sake of this talk, I'm going to kind of equate final causes with teleology, and I realize that when we talk about final causes from Aristotle, what he meant and what we might consider other forms of teleology might be a little bit different, but the idea is still that there's some sort of overarching purpose happening in nature. And Bacon wanted to relegate that final cause or teleology up in the metaphysics area and not inside physics or natural sciences. And he talked about 4 idols, and I think this is from the Novum Organum, which is his big book. We're only going to talk about 2 of the idols that he mentions. The first one's called the idol of the theater, and what he was talking about there was basically the Greeks, the previous well-known eminent philosophers, and of course the ones that were most influential even up to that time in Europe were Aristotle, Plato, a few others. And he really disliked the way Aristotle dealt with the natural world and called it an idol, his whole system. He said that Aristotle drags experiment as a captive constrained to accommodate his decisions. In other words, Aristotle was letting his philosophical theories about the world drive the experimental train, as it were, kind of a deductive way of looking at the world. Either that would happen, or those who may have proceeded in natural philosophy after him, Bacon accused them or kind of objected to them, repudiated them for what he said, jumping or flying to generalities and their principles too quickly. They might observe a few things and then immediately make a leap, an abstract leap to say, well, nature just works this way, and then everything else had to necessarily fall within those categories. And he really strongly came out against these kinds of things. And if you read the Novum Organum, it's really kind of close to a tirade. He really, really comes down hard on the Greeks. And he also went on, though, to say, well, this has also taken place in the eras, in the centuries after Aristotle and after the Greeks had lost prominence in the basically Christianized Europe, either in the form of the scholastics or the alchemists. The method changed a little bit, but they were still not basing their their conclusions about the world as much on experiment, empirical evidence, as they were on philosophical theories or theological theories. And so he didn't hesitate to include some what he thought were very big Christian mistakes too. Let's see if I can find a good quote for that. Well, he said this. He said, the corruption of philosophy by mixing of it up with superstition and theology is of a much wider extent and is most injurious to it. Some of the moderns have indulged this folly with consummate inconsiderateness. They've endeavored to build a system of natural philosophy on the first chapter of Genesis, the book of Job, and other parts of Scripture. And I think what Bacon is implying is that these Christians who followed in the eras after the Greeks probably too easily were influenced by them and still had sort of a top-down approach to exploring and understanding the natural world. The next thing he talks about is a different idol. It's called the idol of the tribe. And the idol of the tribe, it's basically talking about what Bacon sees as the natural way that the human understanding works. And he said, he basically said the human understanding regarding exploring and understanding the natural world and reasoning about it is flawed. He saw serious prejudices there. He says the human understanding from its peculiar nature easily supposes a greater degree of order and equality in things than it really finds. In other words, we were fooling ourselves. We have a natural tendency to fool ourselves and believe things we ought not to believe when we look at the world. He gave some reasons for that. One of them is he said, well, maybe it's because people tend to, understanding is perverted by observing the power of the mechanical arts. And it's induced to suppose that something similar takes place in the universal nature of things. Okay, he said that was not legitimate. We watch things that are mechanically built. I think this is what he's saying, and we assume the universe operates in some similar analogous ways. Another thing that comes out that's sort of scattered through his writings, and it gives me a clue. I can't prove it because he doesn't come out and say it in so many words, but there are some quotes that make me suspect it. He really has a pessimistic view of human understanding because he accepts as an unquestionable given that there's a vast, maybe even a categorical gulf between human thinking methods, patterns, and capacities and those of God. And remember, Bacon was a Christian, or at least he was living in a highly, what do you call, Christianized society. So he knew the Bible well, he knew Orthodox theology quite well. But he had this idea that actually Jonathan brought up this morning, that it was almost an assumption, what they called, what is it, the incomprehensibility of God, that humans and God, the way they might think, just by definition, have to be virtually in different categories, completely distinct, so that we really can't understand the way God thinks, and he can't understand the way we think, or at least he doesn't choose to. And that was an assumption of his. And therefore, if that's the case, then the one who created nature probably had different ways of thinking and perceiving and modes of thinking than we would. And so we can't expect ourselves as human beings, being so different from God, to be able to grasp and understand nature as God really created it. So that was an assumption that I seem to find in his writings. He says, for instance, he says this is a really good quote. The Christian religion, defenders of the Christian religion celebrate the union of faith and the senses as though it were legitimate and gratify men's pleasing minds, but in the meantime confound most improperly things divine and human. So Bacon just doesn't think that's legitimate. You gotta let faith have its realm and let human thinking have its realm. Now Bacon goes on and he says, well, I'm just summarizing here some of the bad effects. So what if they did this? So what if the Greeks tended to be deductive? So what if the human mind tends to look at the planet, look at the universe, look at nature in ways that it really isn't? What if it's not trustworthy? Well, he said some things that sound a lot like certain modern day proponents of methodological naturalism. One of them is that it's a science stopper. If you're going to invoke teleology or final causes, it has a tendency to either stop science or slow it down a lot. He said, final causes are misplaced because handling them mixed in with the rest of physical inquiries intercepts the severe and diligent inquiry of all real and physical causes. He uses the word real there, which is kind of interesting. And it gives men the excuse to stay upon these satisfactory and specious causes to the great arrest and prejudice of further discovery. In other words, it's just slowing science down to do that. It's like a ship that gets dragged down by an anchor. So that's one of his purported bad effects of allowing teleology or final causes in science. Second thing, he says it causes us to have a false picture of reality. I mean, we already kind of mentioned that. The human understanding will invent parallels and conjugates and relatives where there is no such thing. We're deluded. We're seeing illusions, things that aren't really there, is what he says. And closely related back to that idea of how we don't and can't think the way God does, Bacon said our tendency also is that we project our human nature onto physical nature. He says that we don't find the answers that we want, or we find generalities in nature, but we're not capable of resting, and we seek for something more intelligible, namely final causes. But the problem, he says, that they're clearly more allied to man's own nature than to the system of the universe. And from this source, they've wonderfully corrupted philosophy. In other words, it's an anthropomorphism. We're anthropomorphizing nature too much. And we have this tendency. And so with all these, what Bacon saw as dangers to natural philosophy and really understanding the world the way it ought to be understood, he said it's better to just exclude it altogether. Let's put it up in the realm of metaphysics, and let's just stick with the material and efficient causes. He said more than that, too. He went on to have a method, of course, talking very empirically, inductively. Let's start with a lot of data. Let's look at as many things as we possibly can. Let's take it really slow, accumulate tons and tons and tons of data, and really keep a check on our tendency to jump to conclusions. So I think there's a lot of good things there that or have been beneficial to science and understanding the universe. It is good to look at the details and examine nature closely and look for all of its details in a close way. But was Bacon justified in excluding final causes and teleology from the scientific process? And so my response is there's a number of problems here. He started with a good point. When he was opposed to Aristotle, it's, of course, I think someone may have mentioned it in a presentation earlier. Aristotle, well, at least the way I'm understanding the way Bacon quotes him, he was not talking about a teleology from a supernatural governing God or a supernatural divine source, but rather that nature somehow had its own intrinsic teleology. Chairs had teleology, rocks had teleology. It just was part of their essence and their being, almost pantheistic, I would call it. And Bacon, of course, couldn't accept that because he being an Orthodox Christian couldn't, he saw that, I think, as a form of idolatry, that Aristotle had taken this teleology out of God's hands and just put it right into sort of blind nature. And for Bacon, that was unacceptable. The problem, I think, with Bacon is that he then threw the baby out with the bathwater. And what do I mean by that? It just means that he began to think that because the Greeks were misled and because they used this erroneous way of pursuing natural philosophy, that those who came after him were influenced by the Greeks, even in a Christianized Europe, probably were mistaken too, because they resorted to teleological final causes too. But in their case, they would probably give more credit to the Christian God of the Bible rather than teleology being inherent in nature or intrinsic to nature. Now, I would say that's a bit of a problem because I don't think the two are exactly the same. Those two kinds of teleology are quite different. The other thing that's a problem with Bacon is that on one hand, here he goes, he says, he has I think, a contradiction inside of him, and that is that on one hand, he is saying, yeah, let's put teleology up in the metaphysical world, but then he still comes back to a very orthodox statement, numbers of statements where he says, oh, no, it's okay because God still is in control. He continued to staunchly affirm the validity and utility of teleological inferences. For him, God was somehow guiding nature with his own final causes, but strange thing, they're not detectable. You see, that's where the problem comes in. But he doesn't think it's a problem. Both are true and compatible, the one declaring an intention, the other a consequence only. Neither does this call into question or derogate from divine providence, but highly confirm and exalt it. He says that natural philosophy is the surest remedy against superstition. She's a support of faith. It's a faithful attendant, for it exhibits the will. One exhibits the will and the other the power of God. In the 1920s, there's a guy named C.D. Broad who wrote about Bacon, and his conclusions are a little strange. He says that Bacon holds the existence and some of the attributes of God can be established conclusively by reflection on the teleology of nature. And I'm just having trouble figuring out and puzzled by how that can possibly be when he has eliminated it from anything that apparently is detectable. It's just, I think he's clinging to an orthodoxy, and yet he's undermined himself because I'm not sure that he's left himself any evidence that undergirds that faith, that somehow, in some undetectable way, we can know God through reflecting on nature. I'm very puzzled by that, and it seems to be a really big contradiction in his thinking. There's a number of other things. I'm going to skip down, however, right to the bottom here where it says two needed resources. What I mean there is, what would Bacon have benefited from? Well, one would, of course, be 500 more years of empirical evidence. Bacon was around in 1605 to 1621, so he's writing his books, etc. And of course, 500 years have passed since then, and we learned an awful lot more about nature, biological world, cosmology, all kinds of things. So he would definitely have benefited that and connected that if he had been able to connect it better with analogy by use of the tool of analogy. And so that's where I want to kind of go to finish off my talk, is to really talk about analogy. Okay, so let's go on there. Analogy, or what I would call inferring teleology inductively. Brief introduction here of analogy theory, I would call it. A number of analogy theorists talk about what are called higher order relations between analogs, between things that we think are similar. People like Deirdre Gentner, Holyoake and Thagard, there's a guy named Arthur Markman. And they emphasize that good analogies are not just how many similarities, maybe superficial similarities, can we list down. And if two things have 57 similarities, then they're highly analogical. And if another thing only has 7, then one is more analogically valid than the other. They say you have to often go deeper than just the superficial. You have to find higher order relationships. And some of them might be cause and effect relationships. What would be an example of that? Let's talk about teleology. We would, for instance, probably all agree that a tractor is teleological. We could look at a tractor and say, yeah, just by looking at it, examining it closely, I can say that had a designer. It had someone who had an intent to design something. If I look at a symphony, I can say the same thing, but there's very few crossovers between a symphony and let's see. Yeah, there's very few similarities between a symphony and a tractor, but they're both teleological. We can find teleology in both cases. We can infer that they're both designed, they both have a final cause. Okay. Let's see if I can skip down here. Two of the theorists named Holyoake and Thagard, they actually like Paley's argument. I hope some of you or many of you are familiar with Paley's watchmaker argument. It was made back in the early 1800s and has fallen on hard times since then. But as they look back on it, Holyoake and Thagard both say, you know, this is a pretty good argument. Let's see here. It says, the argument from design clearly uses a system mapping as shown by the higher order cause relation in both the source analog and the target analog. So there is indeed an analogical explanation that makes the hypothesis of divine creation a legitimate candidate to be evaluated by inference to the best explanation. So they affirm that there's good analogical thinking going on in Paley's argument. Of course, what they say after that is, well, Darwin came along and suggested another theory, and his theory seemed to answer a lot of questions better, and just by comparing the two, it overtook Paley's argument as the best explanation. But that doesn't mean that Paley's argument is invalid in their minds, at any rate. Now, if you can look at this diagram, I hope it's clear. You've got on the left side cause A, which is known, and it causes effect A down below, which is also known. We've talked about things. Sal talked about some when he talked about and even showed pictures of RAM from a computer versus RAM that we find in our genes.
Yeah.
The idea there is that there's just an awful lot of examples we can find of very close analogies. David Hume talked about analogies a long time ago, and one of the things he said was this: whenever you depart in the least from the similarity of the cases, you diminish proportionally the evidence, and may at last bring it to a very weak analogy, which is confessedly liable to error and uncertainty. Which makes sense. It just means that the less and less your analogs appear to be similar, the weaker your analogy becomes. The problem is David Hume never considered the converse nearly enough. He didn't say, hey, the closer the two analogs come, the more trustworthy your analogy becomes. And that's what we're finding in science. I think we're getting more and more examples, just like Sal showed us today. We've got the example of the RAM in the computer that looks, functions very similar to the RAM inside of our cells. There's other examples, DNA, cellular machinery, things that look like machines because they look, there's such a close analog, close crossover. You begin to say, well, Mr. Hume, if I'm going to use your same argument, then it should be that my analogy is more valid today because I'm noticing more similarities, a closer crossover between the two analogies or the two analogs. Now, the example I want to finish with is this one called synthetic life, specifically talk about Craig Venter and his team who have been working on trying to create a functional cell, minimal cell. And the thing that they have been able to succeed in is that there's this increasingly isomorphic similarity. In other words, what they're creating in the lab comes closer and closer to what looks like cells that we're familiar with, although they're much simpler. And they're not reproducing the entire cell, just replacing the genome. But the point is still made. It still functions. It looks like a cell. And the other thing that's noteworthy about that, not only are they becoming more and more similar, but the essential component in the whole Craig Venter enterprise is that they're teleologically intensive. In other words, everything that Venter and his team has been doing for the last 20 to 30 years has been intelligently guided, has been purpose-driven. They're not just going out there and hoping that something nice comes out of their laboratory. And it's not just them, his whole team of very highly intelligent and trained specialists, but all the companies that supply them with their materials, with their machines, with their equipment. They've benefited from, decades, if not centuries, of other scientists, microbiologists who preceded them. So this whole process is teleologically intensive. And it gives 3 examples there. It's got preparing the genome synthesis, synthesizing it, transplanting it, minimizing the genome. Just at the end of March, they came up with another breakthrough. I think this guy, Fazal Rana, I'm not sure, I think he's a biochemist. Here's a quote by him. They, in other words, Venter's team, depended on the accomplishments of the scientists who came before them, the technology to chemically synthesize oligonucleotides, etc. Go to the bottom. Venter's team would have had no hope to carry out the total synthesis of M. genitalium genome if they hadn't had all these things. Highly teleological. And you've got now, I think, a very good analogical argument because you've got 2 products that are more and more isomorphic. In other words, more and more similar, if not identical. You know the cause of one, and the cause of the one is intelligent design plus a lot of other things, but at least we know teleology is certainly a non-negotiable component. It's totally reasonable by rules of analogy to say, well, the one whose cause we have not seen yet, just like Paul Nelson just talked about, we can still make inferences about that which we can't see. And I think a big tool for that is using analogy, especially as science continues to progress and we find more and more very close analogs between organisms, say, and artifacts. Organisms that occur in nature are artifacts that are created by human beings who are, of course, teleologically driven. So, in summary, you've got that. I'm going to skip back here. My conclusion would be Bacon had painted himself into a corner, and some of it is not his fault. His theology wouldn't allow him to accept Aristotle's intrinsic natural theology, but his ideas of God's incomprehensibility wouldn't free him to use analogy. So my advice would be, his method is pretty good in some ways, in the sense that we should continue to use diligent empirical research and use induction, but analogy, in my opinion, is a key to induction. If we lack something, if we don't see something, we can use analogy. And a part that I did not discuss earlier is that science uses analogies all the time. They have throughout the history of science. They've helped our knowledge increase. It's what we use to go from what we know to what we don't know, because that's what we want to go from. We have a limited scope of knowledge. We want to expand into the unknown, and we have to use what we know in order to better understand what we don't know. So there's my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. And feel free to ask some questions now. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Okay, I'm unmuting the mic. So.
Okay. Anybody have any questions? I'm looking through chat comments here. I'm not sure I understand all of them, but apparently there were some technical problems in there. Do you all see some connections with what Paul Nelson talked about and some connections here with what Sal talked about? Do you notice the analogies that they both brought up? Yeah, I mean, I'm looking, for instance, I remember Paul talked about this triangle model that he used. And I like it, it's great. And when you talk about trying to reach conclusions about whether design has happened or not, yeah, I really appreciate that as a good model. I appreciate what Stephen Meyer talks about when he talks about, what do we use? We use processes that we know, how does he put it, already in existence or something. It's Charles Lyell's principle. If we're going to examine phenomena that happened in the distant past that we can't repeat in a laboratory, what do we use? Well, we use processes that we know exist now. But of course, what do we have? We have processes of human beings using teleology to build complex specified things. That's what Stephen Meyer is actually referring to. And that's how we know and have confidence that when we see specified complexity from our unified experience, it always comes from a teleologically driven agent, which in this case happens to be some human being or any number of human beings. But we have to go by analogy to say, well, that same kind of an agent can be inferred back to the agent that caused these natural systems. And he's using analogy. I think he may not come out and say it, but he's using analogy. And my point is, there's nothing wrong with that. I think what we need to do is continue to get better at outlining what good analogy is, what bad analogy is, how we can trust it sometimes, and other times we should suspect it. Need to get better and better at doing that. But I still think analogy is a fundamental tool, and there's nothing wrong with that.
I had a question for you. It's Heather Zeiger.
Hey, Heather.
So, and then this kind of goes with Sal and Paul's talk as well. So you're talking about analogy, and we need a way to talk about good and bad analogies. And so is there a way to quantify an analogy? In other words, to put a number to just how closely something relates. For example, when I talk about DNA, I'll say, this is an exact analogy to writing, because we can talk about levels of information. But is there a way to quantify it so that we can actually kind of evaluate how good is our analogy?
Yeah, that's really good. I don't have one at the moment, but I think I've definitely thought about that and thought, let's work on that, because there could conceivably be. Give it a point value system or something. Let's take the example of Sal, what he showed today of the RAM in the computer next side by side with the RAM inside of our genes. Maybe we can begin to assign point values to different things. I think it would be good also to learn some more from these analogy experts that I brought up, like Deidre Gentner and Holyoke and Thagard and Markman, because they have some good points in the sense that sometimes just doing a numerical count isn't what you're looking for. If we're talking, for instance, about Sal's example, it isn't just that they look alike. You know, they have the little cake, you know, the cake-shaped things connected by wires. It's that their function is so similar too. And the function actually may count more. You might give them a higher point value based upon function than just by its superficial appearance. Does that make sense? So I would think that's something that we could start looking into. It might be no better than, you know, it might be somewhat subjective, but I think it's worth looking into because, I guess because we reason that way anyway. And I don't know that there's any way we're going to stop reasoning that way. Scientists do it all the time. They have done it over and over and over again. There's tons of examples to show you. So if scientists do it in the natural world and they don't feel the need to defend that, maybe they should. Maybe they should say, well, let's get the rules of analogy all squared away so it can be quantified. Maybe we can try.
Yeah, you were mentioning Sal's example, and it seems like you could almost quantify, you have parts, but then those parts also fit together a certain way, and those parts also fit together a certain way, and they perform a certain function. And so it seems like you can almost, I don't know, put a number to, well, that's actually a higher analogy than just if they looked alike.
Right. I would suggest that would be a good task for engineers. That sounds like what engineers do, right? I mean, for instance, when they go back and reverse engineer something, they kind of do similar things. They're looking at things that they can use for function and how to reproduce that. They're used to thinking in quantifiable terms. Maybe that would be a task for somebody with a highly engineering mind to work on. Maybe there's some scale they can invent. What do you think?
All right. I think we've got time for one more quick question. Rope has a question about Bacon.
Okay.
Rope, did you want to explain your quote in question?
Bacon is positive about teleology. Go ahead, Rope.
Oh, hi. Now, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I can.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thanks for this historical discussion. I really like the discussion of these classical texts.
Okay.
Just trying to get clear about what Bacon thought about teleology. I have a quote. I brought a lengthy quote from the scholar C.D. Broad in the chat.
Yep.
So Broad writes that Bacon holds that the existence of teleology in nature is an obvious fact, and that the investigation of final cause is a perfectly legitimate branch of natural philosophy. It has, however, been misplaced, for it belongs to a division of natural philosophy which Bacon calls metaphysics and not to that which he calls physics.
Right.
So it's simply a statement of the obvious fact that there's no art of applied teleology as there is an art of applied physics. So this sounds like a Bacon who is actually quite positive about teleology, who's more concerned about the sort of fruitlessness of teleology as a part of the natural sciences, rather than being completely for rejecting teleology. What do you think? Do you think Broad is correct in his interpretation of Bacon?
Well, I know that Bacon wrote at least two, maybe more, very positive things like you just said. I have them in my paper. where he just very strongly affirms what I would call an orthodox Christian position, that somehow the natural world does affirm that there is a maker, a teleological final cause, having intentions and purposes. But the rest of Bacon's writings show he clearly wants to get such teleology, or any teleology as a matter of fact, out of what he calls physics, which to me is the day-by-day experimental sciences and the building of theories up from the ground up. He was a very ground-up kind of guy. He wanted to start with all the details, which of course is kind of unrealistic, because eventually you're going to have just a gigantic pile of data, and how do you put them together? That becomes a little bit of a philosophical question, but he certainly wanted to get that out of there, and I see a problem there, because how do you get to generalized conclusions, especially those that would affirm such a positive acknowledgement that God's somehow guiding it all, unless you have some detectable evidence? I just don't get it. And so I think this is a it's a huge cognitive, mental, reasoning contradiction within Bacon himself. He wants to stay true to the orthodox belief, but I just don't know where his evidence is left. He's left himself without any evidence, because you can't legitimately, according to his system, get it out of the realm of physics. Well, where do you get it? I don't know. And plus the fact that if God thinks so differently than we human beings do, then, and if we misinterpret nature so much, how could we ever know it if we were looking at some evidence that God designed something or God had teleology? I don't know how we'd know it. I think he's claiming it almost as an article of faith, and I think that's why he's painted himself into a box. Does that make any sense? So what Broad said about him, Broad is getting that directly from Bacon's writing. So Broad is correct, at least about that Bacon did say that, but he said a lot of other things too. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess Bacon would have to say that you have to have some kind of other method of reasoning besides induction.
Right, and I don't know what that was.
And outside of science, then maybe just basic deduction, like that the directedness of nature requires a director or something like that. Broad says that he acknowledges that we can get some minimal knowledge of God from nature, such as
well, I don't know.
Not very specific.
I don't know how he would, from all that I read, and I read a very big portion of the Novum Organum, all the way to the point where he actually starts going into his experiments. I don't see any mention of how he would get, what evidence would he use? He doesn't say. So I think Bacon was a conflicted man, personally, because I don't see anything in his writings to tell me. So that's about all I can tell you about that one at this point.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know either. I haven't read Bacon's corpus, so.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the question. Yeah, it is. When you read Broad, you'd think, oh, well, Bacon is just fine and dandy, but yeah, it's conflicted.